a round of applause to Ruth Valerio. She has so much experience working in advocacy, in development and sustainability. She's done brilliant things in lots of big organizations like Tear Fund and small organizations like Arosha. And please, let's have a lovely welcome for Ruth Valerio.
Thank you, Krish. Brilliant. Well, good afternoon and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are online around the world. It's so lovely to be here looking at such an important topic for us. Even just over the weekend, I was at a family gathering and someone made a throwaway statement. You know, we got on, of course, to the election and politics, as you can't help but doing at the moment if you're in the UK. And someone made the throwaway line around, yeah, but we've got millions of refugees coming into the country. You know, what are we going to do about it? And I'd been preparing for this talk, so thankfully had a few things up my sleeve that was in my head that I just said, yeah, you know, but one of the things we need to think about and so on. And as I looked around my family with in-laws and cousins and nephews and nieces, I realized that apart from one person, probably every single member of my family and extended family had migration in their history and in their roots somewhere. And I said, but look at all of us. We are all the product of immigration. But somehow it always becomes the other, doesn't it? And we forget that so many of us have our own roots in the migrations that happen, and as we have heard, have always happened down through history. It's been so good to hear the different challenges and the different inputs that we've had already today. I just want to pay tribute to the amazing people who I have been big fans of over the years, and it's a delight to be speaking after them. And I want to look particularly at the topic of migration and climate. Elaine has already mentioned and brought that in, such an important factor when we're thinking about migration. And do have a look, as Krish said, I've got a Challenger bookstall over there on the other side, you know, us and them. Have written a number of books around environment, climate, social justice, wider issues of justice and poverty, and have got various resources that are there. Would love you to have a look at those as well after this session. Is the PowerPoint, you lovely people at the back, do I just click this? Is that up? Oh, it's there, but it's not up on the screen over there. Thank you. Fabulous. As I've been thinking about this topic, and have been thinking about this topic actually for many years and did some writing on it as part of my PhD, one of the things that has been coming back to me has been this phrase from the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman was one of the leading sociologists of the last century. He was an unrelenting critic of modern society. He was himself a refugee. He was forced to flee Poland in 1971 by a communist anti-Semitic movement. And he came to the UK, took refuge in the UK, and became professor of sociology at the University of Leeds. And he lived there until he died just a few years ago in 2017. And Bauman had a genius in being able to capture his thoughts in a series of metaphors. So he has a whole range of metaphors that he uses for different aspects of society. One of the ones that he's most well known for is around solid to liquid as being metaphors of the society that we live in. We've moved from solid society, solidity, to liquidity. But one of his metaphors that has always struck me has been around vagabonds and tourists, as metaphors of people today. And for Bauman, the world is divided into two types of people. There are the tourists, who are those who move by choice. They're free to move, they take good jobs, maybe they become the expats that was mentioned. They move around the world on holiday, they never put their roots down, and therefore they have little interest in community or ecological care because they're just their own little bubble of themselves and sometimes their family moving around the world as tourists. And then you have the vagabonds, who are those who have no choice but to move. They're forced from their homes by environment and social dislocation, needing to find work and the means of sustenance. And sometimes we see this forcibly when, for example, on the islands of Kos or Lesbos, literal tourists are finding themselves mingling unintentionally with literal vagabonds washed up on the shores from Syria and other places. And this metaphor, vagabonds and tourists, just lives with me as we go through the current time that we are in. As we well know, we are in a season with sensationalist headlines. And part of the issue that we face today is our media and the media's responsibility for the narratives that we live with. And one of those sensationalist headlines is around the number of what's called climate refugees. And there is a figure of 1.2 billion climate refugees that is often put out. I've been teaching on issues of climate and poverty and environmental breakdown for nearly 30 years now. And I have often said that by 2050, we will be seeing 100 million people displaced because of environmental crises. This has now jumped up to 1.2 billion. And I just want to tell you that that is a false figure. And so I want us to be really careful in this whole debate around figures and numbers. You've already heard some figures, you will hear some more. You need to make sure they're coming from reputable sources. This looked like it was coming from a reputable source, but when you dig beneath, actually the number crunching has been false. And that number is used in two ways. It's used both to fuel anti-immigration fear and rhetoric, and it's also used to fuel climate change action. Now, I want to be really clear. The impact of the climate crisis is a massive and a serious issue. I won't read through all of the points that are up there. You can see those. We are facing a climate crisis, a climate emergency that is forcing millions of people to be leaving their homes, causing millions of people to be displaced, to lose their livelihoods, to be forced into marriages at an early age, to be forced into situations where they can't get proper education and healthcare and so on and so on. The climate crisis is a massive and a serious issue. It's also just worth me making that point at the bottom that environmental displacement isn't a new issue for us. It's something that we see right back in the Bible with the story of Joseph and Jacob and his sons, or Joseph's brothers, going into Egypt because of famine. This is something that has been known right through history, and you can see here the different points around weather-related disasters and increasing. So 1.2 billion may be a false figure, but I'm not getting rid of that false figure in order to make light of the situation that we have. There are millions being forced into displacement because of the climate crisis. But it is more nuanced than might at first appear, and it's more nuanced than possibly lies behind some of the big statistics that are there. And Krish has picked up actually on some of this already in his opening words. Climate migration or climate movement can be in two ways. Sometimes it's around direct, what we would call rapid onset disasters and emergencies. So, for example, in 2022, more than 1 million Somalians were displaced because of drought. So sometimes you have really immediate climate-related, environment-related issues that hit and that cause displacement. Sometimes you have more indirect and slow onset disasters as the changing climate threatens jobs and livelihoods that then eventually lead people to migrate. So, for example, in rural Honduras and Guatemala, these impacts have combined and amplified other drivers to prompt people to move to cities, to the United States and to other destinations. And increasingly, the two are becoming blurred as you have sudden disasters that come on top of an already worsening situation. So you have different ways by which the changing climate shows itself. Secondly, movement isn't uniform. We have this media narrative of there being this mass movement en bloc moving towards Europe in some horrifying way. It doesn't work like that. Movement isn't uniform. A lot of movement is internal and temporary, particularly when you have a direct, rapid disaster. People want to get back to their homes. No one wants to have to move. If you're living in a village in the southwest of England that gets flooded, you don't want to move permanently somewhere else. You want to get back into your house, and you will do that as quickly as you can. But permanent movement is more associated with slow onset climate change, where the land becomes permanently unlivable, or where there have just simply been too many recurrent crises for people to stay. And then those distinctions, of course, are also simplistic, and there's overlap. So, for example, in 2022, when you had the terrible floods in Pakistan, that was a rapid onset disaster. That displaced internally an estimated 8 million people. Movement at first was internal, but the floods hit a country that was already struggling with economic collapse. And just months later, thousands of Pakistanis then migrated irregularly to Europe. And this caught the headlines when a boat carrying approximately 350 Pakistanis and hundreds of other migrants capsized off the coast of Greece. Pakistanis were not usually among the top 10 nationalities arriving irregularly in Europe in 22. But in the first half of 2023, they jumped up and were in the top 5th. Why? Because of the floods that happened, which was a rapid disaster, but came on the top then of an economic situation that meant that people couldn't return, and so finally were forced to do that longer term international migration. Who is being displaced? It's happening all over the world. It's even happening in the US. You know, every country is experiencing displacement through environmental challenges and the climate crisis in some way. Natural disasters in 2022 caused 3.2 million US adults to be displaced or evacuated. Now, most of those were able to find their way back home as the situation was rebuilt. And of course, it's particularly in lower income countries where the problems lie, lower income countries which have less capacity to deal with rapid or slow climate events. And then the issues compound because refugees and migrants are being disproportionately hosted by countries that are themselves vulnerable to the climate crisis. And then that leads to increasing problems and increasing pressures on those nations and on the migrants. So, for example, Central Americans who moved to Belize then found themselves in situations of flooding and the communities that they had moved to being cut off and unable to receive any assistance. Those who have moved to Jordan and to Syria are placing increasing pressure along with the existing population on the water supplies. That's a huge problem there. And I don't know how much you'll be able to see this, but this just shows the top humanitarian migrant hosting countries and how vulnerable they are. So the darker, the bigger the circle is the bigger the nation they are in terms of hosting others, and then the darker is the most climate vulnerable. Now, don't worry about the actual numbers because there's a classification as to how they've got those numbers, and they may not link with other things because it's how they've counted that. But the issue is the biggest circles and the darkest numbers, darkest colours, just showing how it's not about only the countries that are being left, but the countries that are hosting that are already facing deep climate emergencies and then the untold pressures that puts on them. It's thought that the largest future internal climate migration will be in sub-Saharan Africa and the Asian Pacific region, both of which, of course, are highly vulnerable to climate change. As we're thinking about the nuancing here, it's also worth us just being aware that there is no term, legally recognized term, of climate refugee. So remember that. We've been talking about legal terms a bit earlier. When you see some of the media headlines that are put out, climate or environmental refugee is not a legally accepted term. The 1951 Refugee Convention is around refugee status for people fleeing persecution, and no environmental factors are brought in. And of course, it's really hard to disentangle and categorize why people are moving, which is why I say just be careful of statistics. And people will often cite economic reasons without fully realizing that it's environmental factors that are partly behind the economic situations that they're in. And so it's impossible to predict how many people will move internationally because of climate-related factors. And how many people move in the future will depend on three things. It will depend on the migration and border policies that nations adopt. It will depend on how much governments respond to the climate crisis and are involved in mitigation, i.e. taking action to limit increased global warming, and the adaptation capacity of countries. So the World Bank's worst estimate is that by 2050, there could be 216 million people moving internally as water becomes scarcer and agricultural livelihoods are threatened. But they estimate that if governments take action on the climate crisis and provide money to help nations adapt, then that number could drop by as much as 80%. So adaptation and mitigation are really key here. And I just want to make this link with conflict. Elaine brought it in already. You can't talk about climate and migration without talking about conflict, because the three are so deeply interrelated. We could give examples from all over the world: Chad, Nigeria, Iraq, Latin America, Asian countries. But one example that's often cited is in Syria, where prolonged drought led to internal displacement, which then exacerbated tensions and contributed, not caused, but contributed to the civil war, which has then, of course, led to massive international migration. So let me conclude. Oh, how have we got there? Can we get back onto my slides? Oh, there we are. Thank you. Let me conclude. We are facing a world of increasing climate change, which interlink with so many other factors and crises. And let's also, I would say, remember the millions who actually aren't able to move and are trapped in desperate situations. But we are not facing a uniform mass block of people moving towards Europe like some terrifying tsunami. And we must stand against that sort of fear-mongering rhetoric. And the more we take action to slow down the changing climate and look after the natural world, the less we will see internal displacement and international migration. So, as we have heard loud and clear today, the Christian imperative is not for us to put our efforts into stopping people crossing our borders, but it's to do everything that we can to move away from fossil fuels, to reduce our personal and national resource use, and to provide the finances to help communities and nations adapt to the increasingly devastating climate crisis. And I shall leave it there.